Another package that is part of the tidyR space that helps with the manipulation of data and the structure of data is the package known as tidyR. Again, once you've installed the tidyverse package set, you will find tidyR activated once you have said library tidyverse, and so we find tidyR is also set up to use. Again, there are a variety of different functions that are present in the tidyR package. We will be taking a look at a few of them, but obviously there is much more to tidyR than the functions that we're going to be taking a look at. To start off with, one needs to understand that within tidyR, there are two ways to organize data: in wide form and in long form. Long form data is data in which each column represents a separate variable and each row represents a separate observation. This in the tidyR space is considered to be tidy data. Not everyone necessarily agrees with this structure as being considered tidy data, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we shall consider long-form data where every column represents a separate variable, where every row represents a separate observation, to be tidy data. So what is untidy data or wide-form data? What does that look like? Well, I have an example of that right here. It is going to be the file CO2 per capita. To read this data file in, I'm going to call this CO2 PC, a data frame that's going to hold the data read.csv. I do have a CSV file over here, and the file's name is CO2 per capita.csv. So I'm going to type in CO2. And if I just read this file in, CO2 per capita, and the data has come in, and we find some column specification set up right here. Let's take a look at the data itself. Head of CO2 per capita, CO2 per PC. And if I go ahead and run it, you see that I have a 4x42 table, or table, with country as the first column. So I have a country header over here for the column. And then I have year values, 1971, 1972, 1973, so on and so forth, all the way to 2011. And so this is considered wide form data. The problem with this data structure is the following. While the country column looks appropriate, where the values under this column represent different countries, one doesn't really know what the values under 1971, 72, 73, 74, so on and so forth represent. We know that 1971, 72, 73, these actually do represent year values. But what are the specific values that are being captured by these numbers 15.5, 16.1, 16.7, and so on? Well, and so this is the fundamental problem with wide form data is that sometimes the column headers do not give information about what the value in the column actually is supposed to be. Now, just given the name of the file, I inferred that these values represent CO2 emissions per capita. And so we can restructure this using a function within the tidyR package. And that function is the function called gather. Gather is a function that converts wide form data to long form data. So I'm going to call this CO2 PC long. Or in fact, I'm going to call the CO2 PC correct. To convert this data structure, CO2 PC, from wide form to a long form, the way I would do that is I would use the gather function. The gather function requires the data frame that I wish to gather. And so the data frame I wish to gather is CO2 PC. Now, what I have to specify next are the columns that I want to convert from wide form that are structured as separate columns that I want to take and make into rows. And so my options are over here. Specify either 1971, 1972, 1973, these values themselves, or I can say minus country. This indicates that I want to convert every column from wide form to long form other than the country column. So holding country the same, associate for each year the specific values. In addition to these, I have to specify something known as a key and a value. A key is what is the column header going to be associated with these values right here, the 1971, 1972, 1973 values. Well, those represent year values, so my key is going to be the year. And the value is the cell values. What are they supposed to represent? They are supposed to represent CO2 per capita. And once I go ahead and run this, once we go ahead and take a look at the head of CO2 PC correct, we see that we have country, year, and CO2 per capita appropriately structured. We see that we have 164 observations of 3 variables. A gather is used to convert wide form data into long form data. Now, there are several ways to pick columns that you do want to gather. Another way to pick the columns that you want to gather, I'm just going to copy that line 57, but instead of saying minus country, instead of saying that I am not interested in the country column, I can specify columns based on column position. So I can say I want columns that start at the second position all the way to, notice that I have a 2 by 42 column table, which was what CO2 PC was. And so I want the second column, 1971, all the way up to the 42nd column. And so if I say C2 colon 42, I'm picking based on column position the columns that I wish to gather. And again, if I run this and type in head of CO2 PC correct, I find out that these have been appropriately converted. There are lots of other options as ways to identify columns that you want to gather. For instance, one can use the starts with function. A starts with function allows you to say, okay, only columns that start with, for instance, 19 or 20 would be columns that you want to actually gather. So you can do some pattern matching with this as well. Now, once you have gathered the data, what if you have long form data that you then want to convert into wide form? Well, that is a different operation that is known as the spread operation. The spread operation is used to convert long form data to wide form. And so, to take a look at that, if I do CO2 PC spread as the data frame that's going to hold the wide form structure of this data, I would have to use the spread function. The spread function requires the data frame in the long form. In this way, I have CO2 PC correct. And what I wish to do is I wish to take the year column and the CO2 per capita column and spread them. And so I'm going to say year and then if I take a look at the head of the CO2 PC spread, I see that it goes back to being that structure, country with year as column headers and the values present under those values of year. It goes back to being a 4 by 42 data structure.